This isn't like an Azure virtual reboot, is it?
It's not. It's not. We are.
Oh, okay.
We're doing it from
I
a
wanted to
virtual
make sure.
desktop. Is that what you're saying?
Nope.
Oh,
Good
actually,
afternoon, everybody.
I should have.
doing?
That would have been a good thing to try. I'm doing great. How about you guys?
We're doing good. Doing
Doing
good.
Living the dream.
We got a birthday boy down here, Mr. David Luft. Happy
All right,
birthday.
David's got a birthday today. Fantastic.
Gracing us with his presence.
Just turned 21.
There you go.
That's right. That's what
Thanks for
all
joining, guys.
21-year-olds
We're,
do on their birthdays. They show up for an online webinar in the middle of the day.
We are the Reboot. It is Wednesday, every Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern. Quick introduction here. I'm Brian Bracci with B&L PC Solutions out of Long Island, New York. And to my right is
Brandon Bowers with Eisner Managed Technology Services out of sunny South Florida.
And David Luft out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, with LDD Consulting.
And I am Dave Groot with WinStar Technologies in Culpeper, Virginia. And we're
right.
on at 1:30 every Wednesday, except for when Brian doesn't show up.
Thanks,
true.
Brian.
This is true.
Like last Wednesday.
Had to go to Vegas, didn't you?
I did. All right, so we're going to talk about 365 and Azure Windows Virtual Desktop. This is the IaaS, the Infrastructure as a Service, or DaaS, Desktop as a Service. And they're really, Microsoft has put a lot of time into building this infrastructure out. And, honestly, for us, there's a lot of things for us to kind of pre-configure and work on and make sure we spec things out properly. And Brandon, you want to get started with the different versions of 365, Windows 365, not to be confused with Office 365.
Yeah, I have something to share, but before we do, I guess paint the picture a little bit, and because I find it very confusing because every single time Microsoft releases a product, there's like 10 different versions and the namings are similar, and you're like, which one do I choose? What does this mean? So, what was it? A year ago, they came out with Windows 365, not to be confused with Azure Virtual Desktop. Windows 365 is a fully managed by Microsoft cloud desktop solution. So somebody explained this to me this way, which I thought was a really good explanation. So if you can imagine going to Best Buy, picking up a computer for $600, $1,000, whatever it is, take it home, unwrap it, like that's Windows 365. You're getting a fresh computer within about an hour. There's not much other configuration or things you have to do in the background, which there's a caveat to that if you do Windows 365 Enterprise, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But in general, like that's what you're getting. You add a SKU, just like Business Premium or some other subscription, and all of a sudden you've got a desktop that users can remote into without much hassle. Whereas Azure Virtual Desktop, you really need your typical IT gurus, let's say, working on the back end, creating infrastructure, getting it all together, putting the pieces together just like you would in your typical, data center, setting up servers, setting up infrastructure, but just in Azure instead of in your environment.
And the end user experience is the same, though.
Yeah. End user experience is everybody's using the remote desktop client, not to be confused with the traditional Windows remote desktop connection client. It's just called remote desktop, not remote desktop connection. So just cut off the connection and now you're in the right client.
Now, I don't know a whole lot about Windows 365 desktop, but can you do like QuickBooks and things like that on it too, where you're sharing it with multiple people?
No.
You can,
not easily.
You can. Wait, so let's in a minute.
Easily.
Let's share the breakdown of the differences. We'll get there in a second. But there are ways you can do it with 365.
So I would
business,
say
you cannot.
If you look at it like this, Windows 365 compared to Azure Virtual Desktop is basically the equivalent of a small company going out and buying 5 or 10 computers and getting started and handing a new machine, or a company with 100 users having an IT department rolling out a network.
Yeah.
And that's really in essence the difference. If you're going to go with Azure Virtual Desktop, it's probably because you're going to need line of business servers that are going to be hosted up in your Azure resources as well, or you're going to need some other business requirement that's going to be needing connectivity to that resource from those virtual desktops, at which point you're just building your network out into Azure. Windows 65 is, as Brandon said, it's not something that we can set up groups and images and we can design gets what image based on what department and what programs are allowed to be installed and all the administrative tasks that we would want to do as IT folks.
That's controlled by
Azure
Microsoft,
VD
right?
rollout. And well, it is, unless you put a front-end management program in front of it. And there are companies out there who have built out management for those types of environments because you can be cost efficient for somebody on a smaller business to go to Windows 365, but they're still going to need some of that manageability that they don't get out of the box, right? And that's where having another product or endpoint manager or something good. Brandon, I'm sorry, good.
No, I was just going to say, yeah. So before we, I guess, go into use cases on when one may be better for another, Dave, can you change the screen so we can give a little like high level diagram that kind of shows the differences? Some of this is a little technical, but
You want me to pull up your screen?
helpful. Yeah, if you can.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, so one of the vendors we work with, they shared this at one point. And what you'll see between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop, the connection and control plane is the same. It's still managed by Microsoft, technically speaking, from that respect. But there's a lot of differences as you get into Azure Virtual Desktop with some of the underlying network infrastructure that's required. So with Azure Virtual Desktop, you need to have shared profile capability. So you need a file server, you need some type, you don't have to use a file server. There's other ways to do it, but I want to just try and keep things simple. But when you're looking at AVD, this is the case where, like David mentioned, hey, we've got a SQL server on the back end, or we're using Sage 300 that requires additional servers or infrastructure to connect to in the environment. Whereas with Windows 365, it's much more simplistic and somewhat limiting in terms of what you can or can't do. And that's more around like what backend infrastructure can you actually connect to. There's some caveats to that because Windows 365 Enterprise does have the capability of connecting to some Azure infrastructure, which that starts to create a snowball because it makes things confusing for a lot of people when they're trying to choose a solution. But these are a lot of the major differences. I don't know if David, you can paint any more clarity here, but this is like kind of from a high level.
And I know it's not the David you were talking about, but this almost sounds like the difference between a work group and a local domain.
That's
or on-premise domain.
Yep.
It is, except for that if you're on Windows 365, you can still potentially join Azure AD, which means and be part of your domain if you're a company, right? So for those who are serverless, they could potentially have business premium for their licensing model. That gives them Azure AD, and then they could buy Windows 365 images for their machines, for their users.
And so there's always a caveat here. If you're on Enterprise, you are actually able to.
No, I mean like
some Azure infrastructure,
with some local resources as well.
To me, that's where it's much more confusing for people because they're like, well, okay, so do I do Enterprise or
there are reasons that if you have a local Azure, a local Active Directory on-prem, and you're syncing to Azure, then you're going to want to probably go with Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure for all the stuff that you're doing. It just depends. And then when you talk about can you do things like QuickBooks, well, I mean, sort of. It's got caveats that QuickBooks has all along, right? Like Brandon mentioned, the profiles in Azure AD or Azure Virtual Desktop, if they're persistent, they have to be stored somewhere. That's generally what they call the FS logic memory. And depending on where that lives and how that infrastructure is set up, you may or may not be able to share a QuickBooks database file that could be shared amongst multiple users. So it can be done. but it needs to be considered.
That's true. I also want to mention one other big benefit before we start talking about use cases or pricing or anything.
Sure.
Is that the nice thing with Windows 365 versus AVD is it is truly a fully managed solution. Like I don't need to think about backup. So, it talks about storage here, and yeah, you are using local profiles, but Microsoft is handling the snapshots, the backups. Like I don't need to go in and set up a backup solution. It's just there. I can go in as an admin and restore a VM to a previous snapshot. I can do that in AVD as well, but it needs to be set up that way, right? It's not going to just happen magically without some type of configuration. Whereas if I pick up and add a user to have a 365 business desktop, every single day it does a snapshot, and if I need to roll it back, I can. I think that's all I got for this slide.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay.
So, I mean, then I'll throw out the cybersecurity compliance element, and then that throws all that right out the door, because if I can't completely control it and manage it, then how do I know I have compliance? And so, don't even go there with that, but another conversation altogether.
In a compliance-driven,
in a compliance-driven
environment, it's not a solution. Yeah.
Right.
No, it's not. At least not until it's available on GCC.
Right.
Or something along those lines, right? But,
So just to be transparent, though, is what do you guys think on the sales side of this, as opposed to getting new Windows 10, Windows 11 desktops for $700-800, lasting 3 years with on-site support, versus going this route and having another monthly subscription tied to the account? What's the payoff on that?
Where I see the biggest adoption, especially for Windows 365, is where it's already I'll call it a pretty cloud-enabled organization, but they need someone to remotely access some resources that they don't want the data to live on the user's personal machine. So, hey, I've got a new hire. I don't want to buy them a new computer. Maybe I just want to bring your own device, enable somebody, or maybe they're even overseas. So we're all having trouble finding people, right? I've got a number of clients now that they're hiring people from India, from South America, from South Africa. Now they don't want to ship the machines. We spin up a desktop. They access their OneDrive and other resources that we only allow to be accessible with certain IP addresses and other restrictions that we set up. And the data lives there, right? So if the user gets terminated, that data hasn't walked away on the user's personal laptop or desktop.
it just gives you a single location to lock down, right? Like you can set up one desktop image for your user, and they can access it from any device, anywhere, anytime, and you still have complete control over what it is they're able to do with business resources.
And Dave, share how you connect to your desktop. I mean, you don't even have a computer. You're using like an Android.
And I'm not kidding you. I mean, I use my mobile phone, Samsung. It's got the little DeX program on there. You plug an HDMI into it, and I got a full screen and a keyboard and a mouse, and I'm in my VD.
That to me is
it just doesn't
phenomenal.
matter.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But for a small business,
cellular connection,
for a small business to do this, they'd have to get terminals, right? Wise terminals or something.
I mean, that's one way of doing it. Chromebooks is another way,
right?
Well, you can
do it in a browser.
But they still have to have a device, right? So if you're in the middle of a hardware refresh, you're still going to have to spend at least $400, maybe $500 on a good, dumb terminal for them to connect with. So it's a hard sale, is my point, because
I don't know, because why do the refresh, right? Like here's the deal: we have a supply chain problem, right? We can't get hardware, so instead of them retiring a product at 3 years or 4 years, let them keep it for 6 or 7. What do you care? As long as it can get on the internet and it can open up a browser. Like, can I share my screen for a minute? Am I able to do that?
I will allow it, David, just this once. But I think my question is, because aren't you still supporting that endpoint for the client for compliance purposes, like on their network, and so if it's not
if you lock it down so that they can't save anything locally. I mean, you can do data loss protection, information rights management. There's enough tools in play if you wanted to, that you could literally, if the environment was needing to be that secure, you could stop your users from doing anything outside of that virtual machine, even if they're using their personal computer at home to do it. Like if I like what Brandon was saying is you got a web client, the browser based section. Can you see that? That showing, guys?
It's loading. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm capturing all keystrokes.
It's all right because password's got to get changed today anyway. It really does. I'll have to authenticate it real quick. I'm sorry, guys. Didn't know we were going to be doing a demo. But I just want to show you how easy this is too. Now, all this jumping through hoops here is just because of my over security. So most people wouldn't have to deal with all that. But so you just go here, like, you have groups. Personal desktop, I want a CAD desktop, I need accounting, and then when you launch that,
And just so everybody's aware, this is all a web client, so he doesn't even have an application on his computer that he's using, just a web browser.
this is all in a browser. That's what I'm saying. Like anything that, like an iPad on some level, you could do this, right?
Well, an iPad you can. It has an app. Android, the Apple Store, they all got the remote desktop app that you can connect directly to your desktop.
Yeah.
I think you're missing a few
And
icons.
then, there you are, right?
Yep. Now you're on your.
You're in the desktop and you're working along. Nothing to it.
And that's what you guys use?
So there you have it.
And so,
And,
when
so
it comes
I
to,
noticed. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, when it comes to like use cases versus pricing, like, what do you guys think? When do you use one versus another? What does cost look like to a business? Because Brian was mentioning, like, why am I going to buy this? New computer is just $600. You explained some benefits. Obviously, you can use any device. I mentioned the bring your own device. Maybe somebody's using just their home machine to connect to that central location. But what are you guys seeing in terms of cost to a business and the differences between some of those solutions? So like the Windows 365 versus Azure Virtual Desktop.
So traditionally, the biggest cost with Azure Virtual Desktop for a smaller deployment was the Azure Active Directory Domain Services component. And that was required in order for you to be able to authenticate using the same credentials as you do either on-prem or in Azure. That requirement's going away, or is pretty much gone, now that we can do direct join and we could do Azure AD join. So that being said, you can spin up an Azure Virtual Desktop environment, I'm going to say, for $60 a pop per user.
Yeah, I was going to say what I see with AVD, even with Azure Directory Services, multiple hosts, the more people you get, definitely AVD is more scalable in terms of pricing versus Windows 365. So I've seen it as low as $40 a user, maybe even a little less.
I'm talking like a small, 5-user group. You're probably talking, $60 a pop. Maybe add a $20 business premium license on top of that. So $80 a month, and they've got their environment. It's administratable, it's manageable, it's cloud accessible, it's 24/7. It's whatever you need it to be.
And remote printing is okay. It's just redirected.
As with anything, you got to tweak. If you got security, if you're running, zero trust on your local network, then you're going to need to make some adjustments, right? to allow that environment to print, stuff like that. But yeah, it's all there.
And honestly, the printer redirection works so much better than it ever did in the past with traditional terminal services. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, it was always a pain in the ass to set up and get it, you know.
And with Windows 365 pricing, I mean, it sounds like it's not competitive when at least when I first looked at it. But I mean, you can get desktops as low as, you know, $28 to $32 for something very low end. The typical ones we look at are about $38, which is, I think it's two CPUs, 8 gigs of memory that can run this, you know, all the standard basic day-to-day.
I think it's about 40 bucks.
Well, it's less than that if you have a business premium license because of the hybrid benefits with Windows 365. So
right.
That's where the SKUs make things confusing for everybody, because there's a different SKU for every damn different option, and people don't realize. Best case there is, make sure you talk to somebody before you add those type of licenses, because someone who actually understands, you know, that saves you, you know, all of a sudden now you're saving $100 a year or something just by making a tweak into the SKUs that you're selecting, as an example.
Right.
So I don't know, does anybody else want to share any like great use cases? I mean, what I'll tell you is I've got an insurance company right now where they started, they were having trouble finding people here. They wanted to start hiring these virtual like receptionists or assistants overseas. And so instead of having them VPN back into the office, all they needed was OneDrive access, they needed email access, and a couple web apps. They didn't need any access to the office. So originally what they wanted to do was they wanted to buy computers, set them up on VPN to connect into the office, which that potentially opens exposure to the office, right? Because now you have an unmanaged machine, or even if it's a managed machine, but a machine outside of the US connecting into your office, has access to everything on your network. We spun up these desktops for $38 a month. User gets terminated, you know, fee goes away. And
just shut it off.
Yeah.
Shut it off. Yeah.
Yeah. And none of their data, you know, is leaving that environment. So the experience has been really good. I've also noticed that whatever Microsoft has done over the last few years, when it comes to like even video conferencing, Teams calls and things like that over Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365, like it's a really good experience. It's not, you know, you're not having choppy issues.
Well, they have a special you know, install specifically for that environment that is optimized, obviously, for all those things. And it works phenomenally well. It really does. I'll say in my office, one of the, you know, biggest things that I'm using this and kind of enjoying is, for instance, I got a couple of interns, right, who we have a bunch of computers around, and depending on what computer is open is where they're able to sit today. You know, like they don't have a specific assigned machine to them. So, you know, we have now they're logging into all the different computers. They got to set up their little apps and their little profiles and their little this and their little that. And it's like a lot of time gets put into that. And I'm just like, let's do it once. And then like we just go into the VD and we're done. You know, like it just makes it better. I had a really hard time wrapping my head around that cost. And I'm thinking, like, again, when I can take my mobile phone and get to the full desktop experience just the same as I can if I crack open my laptop, no limitations, I'll pay a couple dollars a month for that. Like, that's worth that feature to me. And again, if you have an 8-year-old machine that's solid, just open up the browser and to the virtual, and your resources are all.
And how are you securing? How do you secure that perimeter? Because you're dependent. Your outbound. Perimeter? Well, your outbound traffic on that VM is through Microsoft.
I mean, there's Azure has firewall if you want the full blown.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So content. What if they have money? If they have a solid infrastructure with, you know, high availability and
I think you treat it the same. Honestly, Brian, you treat it the same. Whatever you have local, you want to put in that environment. So your endpoint protection, your DNS filtering, threat lockers, your whatever
Okay.
protections you're using,
That
treat it the same way.
Well, that's exactly what we're getting ready to test. I mean, I literally am working with a company right now we're spinning up pool instances and personal instances in Azure Virtual Desktop, and then I want to load in my SASE product, right, which is going to put in the DNS protection and all. And I want to see, does that break it? Does that make it, like, where do we have issues if I put threat locker on there? Because this is image based, so
Right.
there's applications there, right? Like I had to learn how to put Sentinel-1 on it because I need a unique ID each time a new machine spins up, and that
Right.
they're recycling back end all the time.
Right.
So you could end up with 100 deploys and only have 2 virtual desktops if you're not careful in how you set that up, right?
Right.
Before we run out of time,
You
I
have to just
wanted
pay
to mention one other, because so many customers still use QuickBooks, right? Like, I don't know how many small businesses, but QuickBooks is by far
QuickBooks is
Every
the
one of my
largest
clients, I
used
think, yeah.
small.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many times in the past we were trying to get rid of the remaining local infrastructure for some reason. We were now all 365, Azure AD, some of the stuff, but we still would have a server sitting around because they had 2 users that needed to access QuickBooks. Like, this has been the biggest use case for us in migrating a number of people to either Azure Virtual Desktop or just a single Windows 365 machine, because now all of a sudden all of the management costs around that local infrastructure go away. We got rid of it, and it's doesn't even equate, having a single VM there, or even one shared resource in Azure Virtual Desktop to have QuickBooks there. We're doing that internally. So, I mean, we've got an AVD deployment for QuickBooks and a couple other things as well, so people can access it anywhere, because we wanted to get rid of the remaining local infrastructure that we had for that. And that's a low cost too, because what people don't think about is once you go Azure Virtual Desktop, not Windows 365, it's also usage-based billing, right? So you can do intelligent things around, hey, our workers only work 9 to 5. Let's shut down some of those resources after hours. And all of a sudden, your bill comes from $300 a month to now $150 a month or something like that, just as an example.
Is bandwidth part of that too? Is that what you're talking about?
Bandwidth,
it's all consumption-based, but
right.
there's reserved incidents.
Yes.
There's all kinds of ways to tap into cost savings when it comes to that.
That's really our role, right? That's not your client's role. You have to kind of look at that and hopefully you plan accordingly and budget accordingly, and you're not hit with something, or they're not hit with something that was
they need someone to advise and calculate those costs. Yeah. I mean, Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Compute, they're all very confusing when you look at the pricing you're trying to put it together, unless you really know what you're looking for. We had a prospect, they were spending $3,000 a month in Azure costs. Once we moved some of their VMs to reserved instances, adjust how their Microsoft licenses were to hybrid, they were under $1,000 a month. Wow. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And can these things, either one of these blue screen, like is that still right?
I've never seen it.
I was
anything's possible, but
it could be a bug check, right? I mean, there's got to be. I mean, why not?
I was just gonna say it's possible, but I've never seen one either in any of our Azure servers or infrastructure.
Okay, all right.
Theoretically, it's got to be able to happen.
I don't know if it's possible.
And you're still running updates on it, right? And it's getting updates up to the OS.
Yeah.
Right. So we all have stories about that. So just again, so that's something.
Look, can be a conflict somewhere, and
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Cool.
Definitely.
Nice, guys. That was definitely, hopefully, informative, and maybe we can do a deep dive, and get a little granular into some of the services in a couple of weeks. But this is definitely something that's been out there. And David, thank you for the subject. Appreciate it. And then we'll get some ideas for next week.
All
right.
Cool. I want to next
guys.
week we're going to talk about how I had a customer paying $370 a month for their phone bill, and now it's like $19.
Wow.
$19 a month.
Same company. Nothing changed except for their phone service.
All right, we'll leave it at that. All right, we're not going to spoil anything.
All right.
See you guys next week.
Sinker.
See you guys.
Bye.